They said the road didn't belong to me. They said I owed them money. They said access was a privilege they controlled. What they didn't know was that every inch of land beneath their threats, fines, and warning letters had already been paid for in full by me. And the moment they tried to block that road, everything they thought they owned began to unravel. If you believe in real justice, earned power, and karma catching up when arrogance goes too far, subscribe now. Because stories like this prove control only lasts until truth shows up. The road did not look important to anyone driving past it. A narrow stretch of compacted gravel and asphalt, running quietly along a tree line, connecting my land to the county highway. It did not have a gate. It did not have signs. It did not announce itself. But it was mine, and it had been built with my money, my permits, and my patience long before the neighborhood behind it ever existed. I bought the land years before the first HOA meeting ever took place. Back when the area was still considered rural. When zoning boards were cautious but fair, and when paperwork mattered more than tone. The property survey was clean, the boundaries uncontested, the easements non-existent. When I decided to build the road, it was not an act of defiance or ambition. It was necessity. My land sat too far from reliable access, and the county required a proper road for development and emergency services. So I followed the rules. Every one of them. Permits were filed. Engineers were hired. Inspections were passed. The county signed off. The road was logged into records as privately owned infrastructure, clearly marked under my parcel number. It took months and more money than most people realized. But when it was finished, it worked exactly as intended. Quiet, functional, invisible. Then the houses came. Developers arrived years later with renderings and promises. A planned community, neatly packed, efficient, and governed by a homeowners association that would maintain standards. Their blueprints leaned toward my property line. Their construction trucks rolled closer to my road. And slowly, without permission or conversation, they began using it. At first, it was subtle. A few vehicles cutting through. Temporary convenience. I did not stop it. I did not block it. I assumed it would end once construction finished. Instead, it multiplied. Residents began using the road as a shortcut. Delivery vans followed. Service trucks memorized it. GPS systems learned it. And then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived. The letter was formal, printed on thick paper, stamped with the HOA's logo. It claimed the road was part of their managed access network. It informed me I owed $300 in road maintenance fees. It stated payment was due within 30 days to avoid penalties. I read it twice, slowly. There was no anger at first, only disbelief. The road was not theirs. It had never been theirs. There was no agreement, no easement, no shared maintenance clause. They had simply decided that because they used it, they owned a piece of it. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I pulled my records, deeds, surveys, county approvals, photographs from construction. Everything was exactly where it should be, clear, unambiguous. I assumed a simple correction would resolve the issue. I was wrong. The second letter arrived faster, sterner, with language that shifted from assumption to authority. It warned of fines. It referenced enforcement. It implied compliance was expected, not discussed. And it was signed by the HOA board president. That was when the tone changed. I contacted the association in writing. No conversation. No negotiation. Just documentation. I explained that the road was privately owned and provided parcel numbers and county records. I expected acknowledgement. What I received instead was escalation. A third notice followed, accusing me of refusing to cooperate. It claimed my road served the community and therefore fell under HOA jurisdiction. The logic was thin, but the confidence was aggressive. The fee increased. The deadline shortened. By then, the road was no longer invisible. HOA signage appeared near its entrance, small but intentional. Cones showed up one morning, narrowing the access point. Flyers circulated among residents warning of unauthorized use by a non-member. They were talking about me. The situation was no longer about money. $300 was irrelevant. What mattered was control. They were testing a boundary they assumed I would not defend. I filed a formal notice of trespass with the county and sent copies to the HOA. I requested removal of signage and obstructions. I cited statutes. I remained calm. Their response arrived within 48 hours. They claimed the road was essential to community safety. They claimed shared access rights. They claimed precedent. And finally, they claimed that if I continued to resist, they would restrict access until compliance was reached. That was the moment the threat became real. I visited the road early the next morning. The air was still, the gravel cold underfoot. At the far end, new barricades stood where there had been none before. Not fully closed, but positioned to signal authority. Control. I stood there for a long time, listening to distant traffic, watching sunlight break through trees I had cleared myself years earlier. This road was more than access. It was proof of ownership, proof of effort, proof that process still mattered. And now, an HOA that did not exist when this land was empty believed it could charge me for standing on my own property. What they did not realize was that by trying to take control of the road, they had placed themselves directly against county law, recorded history, and a paper trail that could not be argued away. And the next step they took would force everything into the open. Because the next notice they sent was not a letter. It was a final warning. And it claimed they were about to lock me out of my own land. The lock appeared before sunrise, heavy and deliberate, hanging from a steel gate that had never existed the day before. It cut across the entrance of the road like a declaration, not just of control, but of certainty. Someone had authorized this. Someone had approved it. Someone believed they had the right. I stood across from it in the quiet morning, the sound of distant birds mixing with the faint hum of the highway beyond. The gate was new, bolted into concrete poured overnight, the kind of work that required planning, manpower, and confidence. This was not a mistake. This was an action taken with full belief that no one would challenge it. The realization settled slowly. The HOA had not misunderstood the records. They had ignored them. By mid-morning, residents began gathering. Cars idled. Confusion spread. People stepped out of vehicles, phones raised, voices low but tense. The road they had used for months, some for years, was suddenly inaccessible. Detours stretched miles. Tempers rose quickly, and blame followed instinct rather than logic. I watched from my side of the gate, saying nothing. There was no need. The situation spoke louder than any explanation could. The association's board members arrived next, confident, measured, wearing expressions that suggested this outcome had been expected. They addressed the crowd with rehearsed calm, explaining that the road was under HOA jurisdiction and temporarily closed due to noncompliance issues. The language was intentional, vague enough to sound official, firm enough to discourage questions. What they did not mention was my name. They did not say who had supposedly failed to comply. They let the residents assume. An assumption did its work quickly. Within hours, complaints flooded the HOA office. Parents running late. Deliveries delayed. Emergency access questioned. The association responded by doubling down, issuing a community-wide notice stating the road closure was lawful and necessary. They assured everyone the matter would be resolved once outstanding obligations were met. That was when my phone began to ring. County officials first, then utility companies, then an engineer I had worked with years earlier. Word traveled fast when infrastructure stopped functioning. I provided documents calmly and thoroughly. Deeds, surveys, permits, approval letters with signatures and dates that predated the HOA by nearly a decade. The response from the county was not emotional. It was procedural, and procedure favored facts. An inspector was scheduled. By the following afternoon, the gate had become a point of tension. HOA representatives hovered nearby, attempting to manage optics. Residents argued among themselves. Some defended the board. Others demanded answers. The road, once invisible, had become the center of the neighborhood's attention. When the county truck arrived, conversation stopped. The inspector walked the length of the gate slowly, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning bolts, concrete, signage. Measurements were taken. Photos snapped. Questions asked. No one interrupted. Authority had shifted the moment that truck parked. I handed over my documents without commentary. The inspector reviewed them carefully, comparing parcel numbers, cross-referencing maps. The silence stretched. The HOA board stood nearby, arms crossed, expressions tightening. The inspector finally spoke, voice neutral, firm. The road was private property. There was no easement. There was no shared access agreement. There was no authority granted to the HOA to restrict, charge, manage, or alter it. The gate, the lock, and the concrete were unauthorized structures placed on private land without permission or permit. They were in violation. The HOA attempted to argue. They referenced community use, safety concerns, long-standing access. None of it mattered. Use did not equal ownership. Convenience did not override law. The inspector issued a formal notice on the spot. The gate was to be removed immediately. Any delay would result in fines. Any further obstruction would escalate enforcement. The crowd reacted in waves. Relief, frustration, anger. Not at me, but at the people who had promised authority they never had. Phones came out again, but this time the recording captured something different. Loss of control. The HOA board did not speak. They did not argue further. They simply nodded, stiffly, and watched as the inspector returned to his truck. The lock remained for less than an hour. Workers arrived, tools in hand, avoiding eye contact. The gate came down piece by piece. Bolts loosened. Concrete chipped away. By late afternoon, the road was open again, as it had always been. But something fundamental had shifted. The association's authority had been publicly challenged and officially denied. Residents now knew the truth. They had watched the board overstep, lose, and retreat. Trust, once cracked, does not repair easily. That evening, another letter arrived at my door. This one was different. It did not demand payment. It did not threaten fines. It did not claim jurisdiction. Instead, it requested a meeting. The tone was careful, respectful, almost apologetic. They wanted to discuss future access arrangements. They wanted to maintain community harmony. They wanted to talk. I read the letter once, then set it aside. They had chosen force over conversation. They had gambled on silence and lost. And now, with their authority exposed, they wanted cooperation. What they did not realize was that the county inspector's report had triggered something much larger than a gate removal. Because when the county documented unauthorized construction, it opened a file. And that file would soon reveal that the road was not the only thing the HOA had been controlling without permission. The lock was gone. But the consequences were just beginning. The county file opened quietly, without drama or announcement, the way most serious problems begin. There was no press, no sirens, no public notice posted on a board. Just a digital record created after an inspector returned to his office and logged an unauthorized structure on private land. From there, protocol took over, indifferent to personalities or excuses. Within days, additional departments were notified. Zoning, public works, legal compliance. Each entry referenced the same detail, an HOA acting beyond its recorded authority. The road had been the trigger, but it was not the only item flagged. When one discrepancy appears, it invites scrutiny. And scrutiny does not stop once it starts. I became aware of this shift when another county vehicle arrived, this time without warning. It parked near the entrance of the neighborhood, not on my land, but close enough to observe patterns. The official stepped out slowly, carrying folders thicker than necessary for a simple follow-up. This was not about the gate anymore. This was about history. Over the next week, inspectors returned again and again. They measured sidewalks, reviewed drainage paths, checked signage placement. They photographed fences, utility boxes, and access points. They compared approved plans against what had actually been built. Each visit drew attention, and each question unsettled the association's leadership further. Residents noticed. Conversations shifted from inconvenience to concern. People began asking what the HOA actually controlled and what it merely claimed. Longtime residents dug out closing documents. New homeowners reread bylaws. What they found did not match what they had been told. The HOA's authority existed, but it was narrower than advertised. Several amenities listed in promotional materials were not officially recorded as common property. Certain access rules had never been approved by the county. Fines issued for years had no statutory backing. The board had operated under assumed power, relying on compliance rather than legality. And now that assumption was being tested. I received another request for a meeting, more urgent this time. The language emphasized cooperation, mutual benefit, shared solutions. It suggested the road issue had been a misunderstanding, something that could be smoothed over quietly. But the tone betrayed anxiety. They were no longer trying to collect money. They were trying to limit damage. I did not attend. There was no need. The county had already begun its review, and my involvement was no longer central. The road was resolved. Ownership was established. What followed belonged to the association and the record it had built for itself. The first formal notice arrived at the HOA office 3 days later. It outlined discrepancies between approved site plans and existing structures. It requested documentation. It set deadlines. It warned of penalties for noncompliance. The board responded publicly with reassurances. They framed the review as routine. They told residents there was nothing to worry about. They blamed clerical errors and promised swift resolution. But their confidence no longer held. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Legal counsel was brought in. Consultants reviewed files that should have been reviewed years earlier. The problem was not one mistake. It was a pattern. The road incident had exposed a governing body that had grown accustomed to acting first and justifying later. It had relied on the assumption that no one would push back hard enough or long enough to force accountability. They were wrong. As the review continued, more issues surfaced. Unauthorized modifications, misapplied fees, maintenance charges collected for areas the HOA did not legally maintain. Each finding added weight to the case file, and each entry reduced the association's room to maneuver. Residents began demanding transparency. Attendance at meetings tripled. Questions grew sharper. Motions were challenged. Votes were scrutinized. The board, once unchallenged, now faced a community that had seen proof of overreach. And it started with a road. I walked that road often during those weeks, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood adjusting to reality. Conversations carried differently. Authority felt thinner. The illusion of control had cracked, and through that crack came scrutiny, doubt, and resistance. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived addressed to the HOA, copied to me as the affected property owner. It referenced the ongoing review and included language that shifted the situation from administrative to legal. The county required corrective action within a specified time frame. Failure would result in enforcement. The word enforcement changed everything. It meant fines. It meant injunctions. It meant potential suspension of certain HOA powers until compliance could be demonstrated. The association had moved from confidence to defense, and now from defense to risk. That evening, a notice went out to residents announcing a special meeting. The agenda was vague, but the urgency was clear. People gathered not out of obligation, but curiosity. They wanted to know how deep the problem went. I did not attend that meeting either, but the outcome reached me quickly. The board acknowledged the county review. They admitted to administrative oversights. They asked for patience. But they did not admit fault, and that refusal mattered, because accountability delayed becomes accountability denied. 2 days later, the county issued its second notice. This one was not a request. It was an order. The HOA was instructed to cease enforcement of any rule or fee connected to disputed infrastructure until the review concluded. That included access restrictions. That included maintenance charges. That included authority they had exercised without approval. Control, once assumed, was now officially suspended. The road remained open. The neighborhood remained unsettled. And the association that had tried to charge me $300 now faced a problem that could not be solved with letters or threats. Because the file that should never have existed was now complete. And it was about to be acted upon. Silence from an authority figure is never calm. It is the sound of power pausing to assess damage, of control retreating behind closed doors to decide whether it can survive exposure. After the county's enforcement order, the HOA stopped issuing notices. Emails went unanswered. Bulletin boards remained unchanged. The system that once spoke loudly through letters and fines went quiet. Residents noticed immediately. The rules had not disappeared, but enforcement had. Parking violations were ignored. Landscaping warnings stopped arriving. Fines that had once been automatic vanished. People began testing boundaries, not out of rebellion, but curiosity. They wanted to know what still mattered and what never had. The board attempted to maintain appearances. They held meetings. They released short statements about cooperation with authorities. They reassured homeowners that everything was under review and would return to normal soon. But normal no longer meant what it used to. The county's involvement had changed the meaning of authority. Without the ability to enforce disputed rules, the HOA's influence weakened by the day. Residents who had once complied without question now asked for proof. They requested documentation. They challenged language. They asked where rules came from and who approved them. The answers were rarely satisfying. The association had built its strength on consistency. Once that consistency broke, trust followed. I stayed away from the center of the neighborhood during this time, not out of fear, but clarity. The road was open. My land was secure. The rest was no longer my responsibility. But the impact of that single confrontation rippled outward, affecting people who had never considered the limits of HOA power before. The county review moved forward steadily. Inspectors returned with specialists. Surveyors rechecked boundaries. Legal analysts compared governing documents against recorded approvals. Each step narrowed the association's options. They were no longer negotiating. They were responding. Behind the scenes, the board faced decisions they had avoided for years. Admit error and accept penalties, or resist and risk losing more. Neither option preserved the authority they had once enjoyed. A letter arrived at my mailbox one afternoon, this one not from the HOA, but from the county legal department. It informed me that my documentation had been added to the official record and thanked me for my cooperation. It also noted that additional findings related to access and infrastructure were under evaluation. The phrase additional findings carried weight. It meant the road was not an isolated issue. It meant patterns had been identified. It meant enforcement could expand. That evening, a group of residents gathered near the entrance of the neighborhood, not in protest, but discussion. Voices were low, thoughtful. People shared stories of fines they never understood, rules that seemed arbitrary, permissions that were denied without explanation. What once felt like individual frustrations now formed a collective narrative. The HOA had not just overreached once. It had normalized overreach. The board responded by scheduling another special meeting, this time closed to non-members and media. The notice cited legal sensitivity. It emphasized confidentiality. The tone was defensive. Control was no longer assumed. It was guarded. Inside that meeting, difficult conversations unfolded. Advisors recommended transparency. Legal counsel warned against admissions. Some board members suggested resignations. Others argued for standing firm. The association fractured internally, split between preserving image and addressing reality. The next day, 3 board members stepped down. Their resignations were brief, lacking explanation. They cited personal reasons. But timing spoke louder than statements. Leadership instability added pressure to a system already under strain. An interim board was appointed, quieter, more cautious. Their first action was to suspend all non-essential enforcement indefinitely. Their second was to request an extension from the county. The county denied it. Deadlines remained. Compliance was required. And consequences were clearly outlined. Residents began to prepare for outcomes they had never imagined. Some worried about property values. Others questioned whether the HOA could survive at all. A few saw opportunity, discussing reform, restructuring, or even dissolution. The community was no longer unified by rules, but by uncertainty. I received one final request for a meeting from the interim board. This time, the tone was different. There was no assertion of authority, no suggestion of compromise. It was a request for understanding. They wanted to discuss formalizing access agreements retroactively to resolve the road issue as part of broader compliance. I declined politely. The road did not need formalizing. It was already formal. What they wanted was legitimacy, something they could point to as evidence of cooperation. But legitimacy cannot be borrowed. It must exist on its own. The county issued its next notice a week later. It outlined specific violations tied to unauthorized control of infrastructure, including access routes, signage, and fee collection. It demanded corrective action within 30 days. It warned that failure would result in penalties and potential suspension of the association's governing authority. Suspension was not a threat. It was a possibility. The word spread quickly. Residents debated options. Some advocated for compliance at any cost. Others argued the HOA had lost its mandate. Tension grew, not between neighbors, but between visions of what the community should be. The road remained open. Traffic flowed as it always had. But now, every vehicle that passed carried the weight of a question no one had asked before. What happens when the organization meant to control everything can no longer control itself? The answer was coming, and it would not be quiet. The 30-day deadline changed the neighborhood's rhythm. Time became measured in notices, meetings, and whispers rather than weekends and routines. Every calendar reminder felt heavier. Every update more consequential. The HOA, once a constant presence, now moved cautiously, aware that every decision could accelerate its own undoing. The interim board attempted damage control. They hired consultants who spoke in careful language about restructuring, compliance, and cooperation. They circulated memos urging calm and patience. They emphasized that the association was still functional, still legitimate, still capable of correcting course. But the message did not land the way it once would have. Residents had seen behind the curtain. Questions that had lingered quietly for years now surfaced openly. Why were certain fees charged? Why were some rules enforced strictly while others were ignored? Why did approvals seem to depend more on tone than policy? Each question chipped away at the idea that the HOA acted in good faith. The county's requirements were specific and uncompromising. Unauthorized signage had to be removed. Access rules tied to non-approved infrastructure had to be rescinded. Fees collected without statutory authority had to be accounted for. In some cases, refunded. Refunds were the breaking point. The moment residents realized money might be returned, attention sharpened. Records were requested. Statements were compared. Long-forgotten charges resurfaced. People who had once paid quietly began calculating totals, adding up years of compliance that might never have been required. The HOA's financial reserves, built on those fees, suddenly looked fragile. Emergency sessions multiplied. The interim board debated which requirements to meet first, knowing they could not meet all of them quickly. Consultants warned that partial compliance could be interpreted as resistance. Legal counsel advised prioritizing exposure over convenience. The association was no longer managing a neighborhood. It was managing risk. I observed from a distance, reading public notices, listening to second-hand accounts. My involvement remained minimal, but the origin of the crisis was never forgotten. People knew where it began, not with ambition or rebellion, but with a simple refusal to pay for something that was never owed. The road had become a symbol, as the deadline approached, county officials returned with a different posture. They were no longer gathering information. They were verifying action. Checklists replaced questions. Compliance replaced discussion. Each unmet requirement was documented, dated, and noted for enforcement. The HOA missed its first milestone. The county issued a warning, not as a courtesy, but as a record. It stated that continued failure would trigger penalties outlined in the enforcement order. The language was clear. Authority was conditional. Time was running out. The board's response was fractured. Some members pushed for immediate, sweeping compliance, even if it meant admitting fault. Others feared the legal implications of acknowledgement. The association split along those lines, each side convinced the other would destroy what remained. Residents watched the struggle with a mix of concern and vindication. Some wanted stability restored. Others wanted accountability. Few wanted things to return exactly as they were. At the next open meeting, attendance exceeded capacity. People stood along walls, sat on floors, listened from hallways. The atmosphere was tense but focused. This was no longer about parking rules or landscaping preferences. It was about governance. The interim board presented a plan: partial compliance, negotiated extensions, continued dialogue with the county. They framed it as pragmatic, necessary, balanced. The response was immediate and divided. Some residents applauded the attempt. Others demanded full compliance. Voices rose, not in chaos, but in conviction. The board listened, took notes, promised to consider feedback. But the decision had already been made behind closed doors. The county was not persuaded. When inspectors returned the following week, little had changed. Some signs were removed. A few policies were suspended. But the core issues remained unresolved. The county documented the deficiencies and forwarded the report to legal enforcement. That was the moment the HOA lost control. The enforcement notice arrived without ceremony. It stated that due to continued noncompliance, the county was initiating penalties. Fines were imposed. Certain enforcement powers were suspended. The association was instructed to cease collection of disputed fees immediately. The notice was public. Residents read it line by line. Screenshots circulated. The language was stark. Authority was no longer assumed. It was restricted. Financial strain followed quickly. Without fee collection, reserves dwindled. Obligations remained. Maintenance contracts had to be renegotiated. Services were reduced. The association struggled to function within its new limits. Board members resigned again, this time abruptly. Their departures were not framed as personal. They were silent. The remaining leadership scrambled to fill gaps, but confidence was gone. Conversations shifted from reform to survival. Some residents proposed dissolving the HOA entirely. Others suggested appointing an external administrator. The idea that the association could simply recover and continue felt unrealistic. Through it all, the road remained unchanged, open, quiet, uncontrolled. It stood as proof that authority, once challenged and exposed, could not simply reassert itself. The county scheduled a final review. This one would determine whether the HOA could retain any governing power at all. The association prepared for it with urgency, fear, and little optimism. Because control, once broken, does not collapse slowly. It gives way all at once. And everyone could feel it coming. The final review did not arrive with spectacle. There were no flashing lights, no crowds gathering in anticipation. It came on a weekday morning, quiet and procedural, the way irreversible decisions often do. County vehicles parked along the street in a neat line, officials stepping out with folders, tablets, and a shared understanding that this visit was not exploratory. It was conclusive. By then, the HOA barely resembled the organization it once was. Offices were understaffed. Meetings were shorter and tense. Communication had become reactive rather than directive. The association still existed on paper, but its confidence had been drained by months of scrutiny, deadlines, and public exposure. Residents gathered at a distance, watching the officials move from point to point. Some filmed, others simply observed. No one interrupted. There was nothing left to argue. The review began with documentation. County representatives requested updated records, evidence of compliance, proof that enforcement powers had been suspended as ordered. The interim board provided what they could, knowing much of it was incomplete. Each missing item was noted, each delay recorded. The process moved steadily, without commentary or judgment. Next came the physical inspection. Signage was checked, access points reviewed, boundaries verified. Officials compared the neighborhood's current state to approved plans archived years earlier. Discrepancies were not debated. They were acknowledged. The association had not corrected enough, and it had not done so in time. The board members stood nearby, silent, watching their authority shrink with each unchecked box. This was not a negotiation. It was an audit, and the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. By midday, the officials gathered privately to review findings. Residents waited, conversations hushed. The absence of drama made the tension sharper. Everyone understood that the decision would reshape how the community functioned, regardless of personal preference. When the officials returned, they addressed the board directly, voices calm and precise. The findings were summarized. Non-compliance was confirmed. Unauthorized control of infrastructure had persisted too long. Corrective action had been insufficient. As a result, the county exercised its authority. The HOA's enforcement powers were suspended indefinitely. The association would retain administrative functions only, limited to maintenance of approved common areas under county oversight. All authority to issue fines, restrict access, or impose penalties was revoked. Any attempt to resume enforcement without explicit approval would result in further action. The words landed heavily. There was no applause, no outrage, just a collective exhale as reality settled. The HOA had not been dissolved, but it had been reduced to something far smaller than it once claimed to be. Residents absorbed the news in silence. Some felt relief. Others felt uncertainty. A few felt vindication. The association that had governed their daily lives now operated under strict supervision, its reach curtailed by law rather than consent. The board accepted the decision without protest. There was nothing left to say. Their role had shifted from authority to administration, from control to compliance. The transformation was complete. In the days that followed, the neighborhood adjusted. Without fines or enforcement, interactions changed. Disputes were resolved through conversation rather than letters. Parking issues were discussed, not penalized. Landscaping differences became personal choices instead of violations. The atmosphere softened, not because rules vanished, but because fear did. The HOA's office hours were reduced. Budgets were revised. Contracts renegotiated. Services continued, but at a slower, more deliberate pace. The association still existed, but it no longer dictated behavior. It facilitated cautiously, under watchful eyes. Residents began attending meetings again, not out of obligation, but interest. Discussions focused on transparency, reform, and long-term plans. Some proposed rewriting bylaws. Others suggested eventual dissolution. For the first time, the community debated its future openly. I remained on the edge of these changes, connected by history but not involvement. The road continued to function as it always had, a quiet line of access that had become an unexpected catalyst. It had not changed. The environment around it had. One afternoon, I received a final letter from the HOA. It was brief. It acknowledged the county's decision. It confirmed that all claims related to the road were withdrawn. It stated that no further action would be taken. There was no apology, but there was acceptance. I filed it away with the others. The story of the HOA's collapse spread beyond the neighborhood. Nearby communities took notice. Boards reconsidered practices. Residents elsewhere began asking questions. The lesson was simple and unsettling. Authority is not self-sustaining. It relies on legitimacy, restraint, and accountability. When those erode, power does not disappear quietly. It is taken away. The county closed its active investigation shortly after, transitioning the HOA into monitored status. Compliance reports would be required. Oversight would remain. The association would not regain full authority without years of documented reform. The road remained open. Cars passed without pause. No gates, no locks, no signs claiming ownership where none existed. It was once again what it had always been, a piece of land serving its purpose without conflict. But the neighborhood was no longer the same. People spoke differently now. They questioned more. They assumed less. The idea that an organization could act without challenge had been disproven, publicly and permanently. The HOA had lost its grip, not because someone fought loudly, but because someone refused quietly. And that refusal had reminded everyone that ownership, law, and truth still mattered. The consequences would continue to unfold. Because even stripped of power, the HOA still existed. And what it chose to do next would determine whether this story truly ended, or merely paused before its final chapter. The days after the county's decision felt unfamiliar, like waking up in a place that looked the same but behaved differently. The streets were unchanged. The houses stood as they always had. Yet something intangible had shifted, leaving the neighborhood quieter, more deliberate, less tense. The absence of enforced authority created a pause, and in that pause, people began to reassess what community actually meant. The HOA continued operating, but its presence was subdued. Emails were shorter. Notices were informational rather than directive. Meetings focused on budgets, maintenance schedules, and compliance reporting. Gone were the warnings, the penalties, the language of obligation. What remained was administration without dominance. For some residents, this felt like freedom. For others, it felt like uncertainty. People had grown accustomed to being told what to do, even when they disliked it. Now, decisions required discussion. Disagreements required conversation. Responsibility shifted from an external authority to the collective. That transition was not seamless. Small conflicts emerged. Parking disputes lingered longer without quick enforcement. Maintenance concerns required coordination rather than mandates. Some residents missed the simplicity of rules, even flawed ones. Others welcomed the chance to shape outcomes rather than accept them. The interim board struggled to redefine its role. Members attended meetings with careful language, aware that any overstep could invite renewed scrutiny. They consulted county liaisons before making decisions that once would have been automatic. The association's power had been replaced with caution. Transparency became the new currency. Financial records were shared openly. Past fees were reviewed. Refunds were discussed, sometimes contested, sometimes delayed. Each disclosure reopened old frustrations, but it also created clarity. The story of how authority had been built, extended, and abused unfolded slowly, documented line by line. Residents listened. Some felt anger at what they had paid without question. Others felt embarrassment at how long they had accepted explanations without proof. But most felt something closer to resolve. They wanted to ensure the situation never repeated itself. Committees formed organically. Groups discussed rewriting bylaws to clearly define limits. Others researched alternative governance models. The idea of dissolving the HOA resurfaced, not as a threat, but as a possibility. If authority required legitimacy, legitimacy required consent. The road continued to anchor these conversations, even when unspoken. It had become a reference point, a reminder of what unchecked assumption could lead to. No one attempted to claim it again. Its ownership was settled, both legally and symbolically. I observed these changes without interference, but not without reflection. What began as a dispute over $300 had evolved into a lesson about boundaries. Not just physical ones, but institutional ones. The line between management and control had been crossed, and once exposed, it could not be ignored. One evening, a resident approached me near the road. There was no accusation, no tension, just acknowledgement. a simple expression of appreciation for standing firm when others would have complied. It was not gratitude for victory, but for clarity. That clarity spread. Nearby communities reached out quietly. Board members from other neighborhoods requested information. Residents elsewhere asked questions about their own governing documents. The ripple extended beyond this place, touching others who had accepted authority without understanding its source. The county noted the change as well. Compliance reports showed improvement. Cooperation replaced resistance. The HOA, diminished but stable, followed guidelines carefully. Oversight remained, but the tone softened. Enforcement was no longer necessary when compliance was visible. Time passed and the urgency faded. Life resumed a rhythm that felt less constrained. People adapted. The community found equilibrium, not because rules returned, but because accountability had been introduced. The idea that authority could be questioned without chaos had been proven. The interim board announced elections, the first in years that felt meaningful. Candidates ran on platforms of transparency, restraint, and service rather than control. Voter participation increased. Engagement replaced apathy. The results brought change. New leadership approached governance differently. They spoke of stewardship rather than enforcement, of collaboration rather than compliance. The HOA did not disappear, but it evolved into something smaller, more careful, more accountable. I received notice of the changes through a community update, not because I was required to, but because transparency now included everyone affected, not just members. The road was mentioned only once, as a resolved matter, a closed chapter. Yet its influence remained. On a quiet afternoon, I walked its length again, listening to the same sounds I had years before when it was first built. The gravel felt familiar, the air unchanged. The road had never needed authority to function. It only needed recognition. That realization echoed beyond the property line. Authority, stripped of assumption, reveals its true form. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes it is excessive. And sometimes it exists only because no one has said no. This community had said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough to force a reckoning. The HOA still existed, but it no longer commanded. It operated within limits, accountable to those it served and watched by those empowered to intervene. The balance was not perfect, but it was real. As the neighborhood settled into this new phase, one question lingered quietly beneath the surface. With control gone and power reduced, what would the HOA choose to become? The answer would define whether the story ended in reform or whether one final reckoning still waited ahead. That answer was coming, and it would arrive not through authority, but through choice. The final shift did not come with conflict. It arrived quietly, through paperwork, votes, and a collective understanding that the community no longer needed what it once feared losing. The HOA's future was decided not by pressure from the county, but by the residents themselves, informed by everything they had witnessed. The election results were certified without dispute. The new board took office with a mandate unlike any before it. They were not chosen to enforce, intimidate, or control. They were chosen to manage carefully, transparently, and within clearly defined limits. Authority was no longer assumed. It was granted conditionally. One of their first actions was symbolic but deliberate. They commissioned an independent legal review of the HOA's governing documents, not to expand power, but to restrict it. Clauses were rewritten. Language was clarified. Enforcement mechanisms were narrowed. Oversight requirements were strengthened. Every change was published, debated, and approved in open meetings. Residents participated in numbers never seen before. The process was slow, sometimes frustrating, but it was honest. Decisions took longer because consensus mattered. Disagreements were aired instead of suppressed. What emerged was not a stronger HOA, but a more accountable one. The county reviewed the revisions carefully. Compliance reports improved. Oversight requirements were reduced incrementally. The association earned back a measure of trust, not through authority, but through restraint. The lesson had been learned on both sides. Refunds were finalized. Some residents received small amounts. Others received more than expected. The association issued explanations, acknowledging that certain fees had been collected without proper authority. There was no defensiveness, only resolution. Money was returned not as an admission of guilt, but as recognition of responsibility. With finances stabilized and enforcement curtailed, the HOA's role became clear. It would maintain shared spaces, coordinate services, facilitate communication. Nothing more, nothing less. The idea of dissolution was discussed one last time and ultimately rejected, not because the HOA was indispensable, but because it could now exist without harm. It had been reshaped into something functional rather than dominant. The road was never mentioned in those final debates. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. I received a final letter months later, this time from the new board. It was not a notice, request, or explanation. It was simply an update sent to all affected property owners, confirming the conclusion of the county's oversight phase and the successful transition to revised governance. The road was referenced briefly, described accurately, legally, and without challenge. It was acknowledged as private property. No conditions attached. I filed the letter and closed the folder that had grown thick over the years. Life returned fully to normal after that, though normal now meant something different. The neighborhood felt lighter. Conversations were easier. Tension no longer lingered in small interactions. People waved instead of watched. They spoke instead of assumed. The absence of fear created space for trust. Other communities followed similar paths, inspired quietly by what had happened here. Some revised their rules. Others questioned their boards. A few dissolved entirely. The ripple continued, not as a movement, but as awareness. Authority, once questioned, is rarely accepted blindly again. I walked the road one final time at dusk, watching the light settle across the surface I had built years earlier. It looked exactly the same as it always had. The difference was not in the road, but in what it represented. It was no longer just access to land. It was proof that ownership matters, that documentation matters, that silence does not mean consent, and that power, when unchecked, will always overreach. The HOA had not been defeated. It had been corrected. That distinction mattered. There were no villains left to confront, no fines to dispute, no gates to remove. The conflict had resolved not through force, but through process. Not through volume, but through clarity. The story did not end with victory. It ended with balance. The road remained open, quiet, unclaimed by anyone who had not earned the right to claim it. Cars passed freely. Life moved forward. The community existed not under control, but under agreement. That was the outcome no one expected when a $300 demand arrived in the mail. But it was the outcome that followed when someone chose not to comply with what was never legitimate in the first place. And in that choice, an entire neighborhood learned the difference between authority and assumption, between power and ownership, between rules that protect and rules that dominate. The road had never belonged to the HOA, but it had given the community something far more valuable than access. It had given them awareness. And once awareness takes root, control never looks the same again.